Until this technological moment where you have this YouTube Zoom combination, we really couldn't do a certain fullness of the relational or the communal ontology that some Orthodox people will say, or the image and likeness of the Trinity. I do think, as they have spoken of the oral tradition and the written tradition, we are in a sense in the Zoom tradition. It will change how the mind works. It will change how people relate, and I do think it's basically our best shot at saving democracy from eating itself, because democracy is ultimately, as Hunter says at UVA, substantive democracy, which requires the ability from people with different first principles to interact. And if we can't arrange that and learn to do it and see that as all angles of the same X that is actually fuller because of that multi-angle perspective, well, then we're going to give up on human interaction. We'll fall back into governmental tribalism. And there's something to be said about a robust identity, but there's also something dangerous about a robust national identity if it leads to walls. There's a difference between definition and walls. If you don't have definition, you go crazy. But if you have walls, you eventually starve to death on the lack of your spiritual nutrition that can only be found in relation with the other. And so there is something to be said about strong definition, but that always runs the risk of tempting one to remove themselves from the rest of the world, right? And I think we're in the age of that absolute choice. And this kind of activity and technology, I think, is critical for training people into not giving into that temptation of isolationism. There's a danger in saying, well, is being alone in solitude bad? No, that's not what we're saying. It's hard to fully develop without that. It is the moralization of the exclusion of the other, because, they're wrong or they're a threat, right? I think we're in a global political moment tempted by that. But if we're going to also say, well, we don't want to do that, well, what's the field? What's the technology? What is the culture being made to show an alternative to that, right? I think it is happening. From the little corner of the internet, liminal web, philosophy, all of these things are little hubs of what really a new democracy that was not merely a silly voting system that calls itself democracy, but really it's captured by K Street, like a real Tocqueville democracy, which is ultimately just philosophical dialogue for Tocqueville. That's possible now. And we need to really embrace that, in my opinion. Freedom of speech is not about, in my opinion, it is not primarily about the arriving of capital R rationality. The freedom of speech is the necessary preconditioning for the orbiting and the working up toward the beautiful, of which then actually emergently gives us the creative. The point of freedom of speech is to say things you've never thought before. Because does that not happen when you're talking with people? Suddenly you have ideas you've never had. Suddenly you're thinking things you've never had. It would be very silly to suggest that conversations are simply the unfolding of a rationality that knew everything it was going to arrive at ahead of time. No, best conversations tend to say things you never thought, and then you go off and think about afterwards. Without freedom of speech, you cannot have creativity. Creativity is actually the secret to democracy and the acknowledgement of creativity. But the organizing principle of democracy then, following, Schindler and Vervaeke and Thomas Jockin and Plato, all these people, is an orbiting of the beautiful. The dilemma is that if you experience too much of the beautiful too quickly, it reduces you to ash, as Beatrice said with Dante and Simile. It destroys you, actually. Precisely the holiness destroys you. And so there's a tension throughout the entire Bible of how to deal with that. We need to approach the holy, but the thing we're approaching can destroy us. That very problem then is what the church has to think. How do we have a certain holiness that is inclusive in a manner that can bring people in without overwhelming them or destroying them in the process or overwhelming them with guilt, but also having real beliefs, but not introducing them in a manner that is destructive, right? It's almost like, I almost want to say strategy instead of evangelism. There's a certain art now of a way to go about the church, to go about Christianity that has a deep awareness of the tension between inclusion and holiness.
And it is something like this balance of veiling and unveiling. It's a very careful, slow, patient process of helping people to know, really, that knowledge itself must unfold, but only at the rate by which it can be known. And so we're so used to, I think it's correct to say, symbolically, a more masculine way of seeing communication, which is that it is a straight line, and that if I say something, it has been communicated, because once it has been spoken through the megaphone, it is done. It has been communicated. But the problem of communication for Jesus seems much more complex than that. He seems to be much more interested in the subject, in the person receiving it, in the person who is receiving it. And if they have not received it, then it has not been communicated. It seems to be his philosophy of communication, really. And so Jesus himself refuses to be straightforward in the way that he delivers it himself, let's say. And I think that's because he has a strategy. And his strategy is that if I give you myself too straightforwardly, then you will not have myself. You will have, to use some language from another one of your conversations, you'll have a category which tricks you into believing that you have the thing. And I think Jesus knew that. The category already existed, right? It's not even just a modern problem. People had the category of, are you the Christ? And they wanted him to say, yes, I am. And then they wanted to say, good, let's go defeat the Romans or whatever they wanted to do. And of course, this actually happens in the Gospel of Mark. So it's like 8 full chapters of Jesus really quite mysteriously hiding his identity, doing something that would clarify his personhood, truly clarify his personhood, and then saying, don't tell anyone. Don't let anyone know that I just did this thing. It's like when Moses comes down the mountain, he has to be veiled because even the secondhand glory of God would kill the people that he's around. So he has to be veiled for the sake of the world. And that's good, because if revelation, if the day of days came now, it would not be merciful. Right. And so the mercy of all of Scripture is that God, very much like the tabernacle itself, it is layers upon layers of coverings in order to layer upon layer uncover, in order for us to see him, and for that, one, not to be a problematic category that we make it into, and two, not to die in his presence. So,
absolutely magnificent. It's also, I think, important in the way Jesus does things in this kind of unveiling thing. That is the only alternative to an accelerationist logic that the world is now stuck in, that Nick Land talks about, the technological capital, where everything speeds up and eventually it's like Franz Kafka in the little hallway and you can't turn around, right? The only way to not be stuck in that game theory dynamic is something like what Jesus is modeling. Jesus models a kind of mode of interaction that actually is a way to escape the trap of accelerationist logics that we are now in with technology. That is the same logic of capital, which is the same logic of institutions, which is the same logic of civilization as a whole. Now, I'd have to trace that out.
I would agree completely. Yeah, I just to add to that, I would say he in some ways, even in his very grammar, and even in the grammar of his actions, because you could see in a sense that his actions are parables. His parables are parables, but every one of his actions is also a parable.
Yes.
And if you take those together, what you find is that he himself is like a gateway, like an invitation back into an integrated kind of knowing. Because the problem of knowing is this divorce between abstract and concrete. The problem of myth is that it's not real. It's a story it's real within the story, but it's not as real as your chair or whatever. And so he goes further and says that incarnation becomes a sort of solution to the problem of myth. He says that incarnation is the realizing of the story. It is basically like to take the patterned reality of meaning and make it into the concrete reality of fact. This divorce in our epistemic experience comes from the fall to some degree. And I think Barfield seems to say, look, even if you go back closer to the fall, you'll find that we are more of oneness between the concrete and abstract ways of knowing. The words themselves used to not even be signs and signifiers, but they used to actually just be a kind of encapsulation of the reality of the thing itself. And so, and he's trying to sort of recapture that. He's saying we actually have to go back into language, almost like a fossil record. He says like fossil records will show us about the dead world that we've left behind. But language is actually a living fossil record that can show us our own souls, which still exist, but are buried somewhere like fossils beneath the surface. And if we can bring up the spirit of language, where it wasn't just a signifier, we can actually revive ourselves or revive our consciousness back into a lot of things that you talk about, back into a reclamation of the subject within the act of knowing. So anyway, I didn't mean to make that as large of an intermission as I just did, but I'm wondering how that relates to what you're saying about this.
It's the question of the replacement of humanity or the extension of humanity. Technology is a trade-off. You gain and you lose, and you need to be very aware. And that's a matter of, being wise as serpents, paying attention to the particular dynamics of every technology. The way the cell phone changes the human is different from the phone on a wall. The way that TikTok affects you is different from YouTube. There's a certain shrewdness where simply saying technology is bad or technology is good will not do. You have to go into every technology with an awareness of how it affects you, and the technology won't tell you. You have to work on your own wisdom and discernment. I think is the challenge now, and we have to be very discerning about that.
The way that I talk about it is tricking the trickster.
Yeah.
These technologies are sort of like genies, and the genie story arc is one where you actually can get something from the genie. It's not always like, oh, stay away from genies, they're tricksters. There's a deeper story arc there, which is like, okay, the genie is there and he's offering you everything. Don't be tempted to think that this is a simple bargain. Find out how you can trick the genie into getting what you actually, the Rumpelstiltskin story is about that. You sort of have to name the thing, and then you can have not only what it gives, but freedom from it. But if you think that you can just get whatever you want from it, you're going to become a slave to it.
Your piece on the genie was magnificent. That's a tremendous, and I think there is a way to look at many of these folklore stories, if you will, as actually parables of technology. I think that's very astute, and I think the genie is a perfect.
Genie comes from a lamp. It is very much a technology story.
It is a perfect metaphor. I think it's extremely useful, and that's also an example where metaphor is useful, because once you think of technology as a genie in the way you've described it, it has practical implications for how you use the technology, right? This is where stories are not merely decorations, as people like Hofstadter or Richards or Postman, Roger Scruton said something like, it really does matter what illusions, what stories, what descriptions you have in the treasure chest of your soul. Because if you open that chest and you're looking for a way to understand what's going on and there's nothing in there, you're going to be weak, because there's a way in which language, as a technology in the good way, actually provides a certain self-defense against notions that are in the air that, if you can't properly frame, could take you anywhere. And so,
like not finding out Rumpelstiltskin's name.
Exactly.
You're still the slave.
Yeah, but that's a beautiful example. If one has not read the books or the metaphors, it seems like, that's just that's all just preference. It's just an option of entertainment. But really, it's going to determine if you know Rumpelstiltskin's name when he shows up. And if you haven't done it, you're in trouble. I always like to associate philosophy with self-defense with David Hume and different things. Like it really does matter. And that means I have to do that day in and day out. It is never over. And I can always be surprised, which means there can always be a meaning that is not merely a syllogism, but a strike of beauty that comes forth and transforms.
You don't want to ride a horse where the horse is the one deciding where you're going, right? It won't work very well. And Andy Crouch talks about devices versus instruments or something like that. You want to make sure that you're using your technologies as instruments, meaning don't even get on the horse until you have someone who's teaching you how to be the master of the horse. Because if you're not the master of the horse, it will be even an insult to the horse, in a sense. And so that seems to be a pretty profound insight into, I think, the way that dominion works, and the sort of stacking levels of dominion, is that we have to make sure that we can be the master over nature, not as though we are negating nature or something like that, but we're actually glorifying nature by finding our place as someone who can instrumentalize it in the best and most beautiful ways possible, as opposed to someone who, like Lewis says in Abolition of Man, man's conquest of nature becomes nature's conquest of man.
100%.
And if you think you just have conquest over it, you're actually being used by it, and it's riding you.
Completely. Basically, to say something provocative, calculation without imagination, as we put it, leads to the logic of techne that becomes the logic of capital. Not that capitalism is bad, but capital outside of social imagination becomes auto-cannibalistic, which is a loaded sentence that I'd have to explain. But it becomes capital,
Yes.
which then leads to AI. Basically, the problems of the modern world, you could say, or the world of 2025, is we are now facing the results of a calculation that has been dehumanized and outsourced to systems, institutions, and technologies that have a life of their own. And
Yes.
basically the question is, will we change course, or will we rise to that occasion? Now, if we do, it's not necessarily a mistake, because you sublate all this into a higher beauty, as we've been suggesting, but there is a real choice. And I think it does tie to the question of dominion. You know, who has dominion over the woods? The one who can go in with the skill to survive amongst the trees, to do a tent and survive and, you know, find themselves in nature and enjoy the trees, or the one who has to cut it all down? Who's really stronger? Who's really the one who has dominated nature? The one who has to destroy it, or the one who can live amongst it? And I think
the proper relationship between the masculine and the feminine.
That's exactly right. And I think basically whenever you have this language of dominion, or, you know, or rulership, etc., so forth, you don't rule that of which you have to make submit to you. In fact, you're weak. That's always the revelation. The one who has to cut down the forest is actually weak compared to the forest. The one who can go into the forest and live amongst it, that is the strong one. Strength does not erase. Strength dwells, because it is a place of dwelling that we can experience the beautiful and have conversations like this. So, Ross Byrd, I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you, sir. We will talk again. I've really enjoyed it, sir. It's been a complete delight.
It's been fun.
There is something interesting about, you know, the Tower of Babel, where it's almost like the problem is a city that tries to control the vertical, right? It tries to, as opposed to a city that is honoring the fact that the vertical must be outside of it, right? There has to be this point of incompleteness, the veiling, so that it's unveiling, right? Like, that's the weird thing. Like, a city has to have the unveiling structure with the UN in parentheses, but it doesn't do that if it tries to own the vertical. The vertical has to be that of which is absent from the unveiling, precisely so that the city is a veil of it, precisely so that you can handle the vertical as opposed to destroy it, right?